Hello, Dublin! I'm David McDonnell, and it is wonderful being in Dublin, Ohio virtually, which is not as nice as being in Dublin for real, live, but it is much better than not being in Dublin, Ohio at all. Now, I am an author, a storyteller. I've been to the Dublin Irish Festival many years and loved every one of them and was so looking forward to going this year. But thank you for the city and the sponsors and the volunteers and everyone else who've decided to continue the festival, but in a virtual mode. That's probably the right way to do it. Now, I was asked to tell a story, and I decided the story I would tell is my favorite story. Since I'm not going to festivals weekend after weekend this year, 2020 it was not to be. So I thought I'd pull out my favorite story to tell you. And this is not an original story. It's a story by the late Eamon Kelly, a brilliant Irish Shawnee who told stories for many, many years. And this is one of his, and it is my favorite. It's called the Tayman. Now, Tay was not original or indigenous to Ireland, but when it was introduced to the island, the Irish took to it immediately. They love their Tay. And they'll have Tay in the morning, and the afternoon, and the evening. Doesn't matter what time. And in fact, it is by far, I think, the most popular beverage in the island of Ireland, or at least the most popular non-alcoholic beverage. Now, in days gone by, particularly in rural Ireland, the Irish could not go to the store to buy their Tay for a very simple reason, and that is there were no stores. Now, an enterprising young man, the Tayman, came up with an idea of how to make a living in those times. And what he did is he went to a town which actually had stores, and he bought a satchel full of Tay. And it was a large satchel. Like, it contained a fair amount of Tay, but it was not so big that he couldn't carry it. He put it on his shoulder, and he could carry that satchel full of Tay. And his idea, which today we would call a business plan, was to go from village to village, town to town, and sell his Tay. And of course he didn't have enough money to buy the Tay, so he first went to a gambling man. And his plan was to travel as much as he could until he sold all his Tay, go back to town, pay off the gambling man, together with the ungodly amount of interest that gambling men charged. And whatever was left over was his profit. That was his earnings. And so he set off on his journey, carrying nothing much more than his satchel full of Tay. And he traveled, as I said, from village to village, house to house, selling his Tay, and little by little he had some money in his pocket, and his load of Tay became lighter. But he had been on this journey for weeks and weeks. And of course, as you might imagine, again using modern parlance, his margin was quite low. So he didn't stay at a public house. Rather, at the end of each day, he would find a spot in the meadow and spend the night there. And if it was raining, as it wont to do in Ireland from time to time, he'd find someplace dry he could sleep, like under a bridge, anywhere he could keep dry during the night. And once in a while, people would invite him to stay in a barn or anything else that would keep him dry on a rainy night. Now, he had been on the road for several weeks. His load was getting lighter, but he still had a fair amount of Tay to sell. And he was heading west, and he was pretty far west in Ireland. West enough where he could kind of smell the salt air. and he knew he was approaching the ocean. And then he saw, late in the afternoon, early evening, he saw dark clouds, black sky along the horizon to the west. Blue skies up above, but black sky to the west on the horizon. And he knew what that meant. That meant that there was a storm coming over the Atlantic, and it was heading inland. And it looked like it could be a serious storm. Now, he was at the end of the day, and he thought about trying to find a warm and dry place to spend the night. But he saw one more house, not terribly far away, and he thought he would try to make one more sail before looking for shelter for the evening. So he walked up to the house, knocked on the door. A man answered, who was the husband of the house. And he said, "What can I do for you?" And the Tayman said, "I am the Tayman. I'd love to sell you some tea. Are you in need of any tea?" And the husband said, "Yes, we are. We're running low on our tea. So please come in, and we'll talk about your wares." Now the Tayman walked into the house. That's a typical Irish hovel of Western Ireland. There was a dirt floor. It was a single room. There was one table in the middle of the room with a couple of stools around the table. There was one bed. There was a crib for the wee one. And not much else. Now, in the typical Irish hovel of the day, the cooking and heating was done on the dirt floor with a tripod and a pot that you could use to heat your food. And the smoke would kind of billow up the room and through the thatched roof. But this house was different in that regard, in that it had a stove. And the Tayman hadn't seen that in many homes in that region. Now, the stove didn't have a chimney either. It just whatever was cooking, the smoke would kind of billow up through the thatched roof. But the difference was you had this aroma coming out of whatever was being baked in the stove. Now, the wife at the time was baking a cake. And the aroma of the cake just filled the whole room of the home. And the Tayman, being on the road for several weeks, hadn't smelled such a wonderful aroma in quite some time. So it was wonderful to be invited in. He sat on the stool. The husband sat on another stool and the wife on another, and they chatted a while. The Tayman gave him his price for what he was selling the tea for. They haggled a bit and finally agreed upon a price. Now, based on that price, the husband did some mathematics in his head, figured out how much tea he could buy. He reached in his pocket, pulled out some shillings, handed them to the Tayman. The Tayman took some tea out of his satchel, measured out the right quantity, put them on the table for the husband and the wife, and boom, the deal was done. Now, again, because it was getting late and the Tayman knew a storm was coming, the Tayman very politely said, "Thank you so much, but I have to leave. There is a storm coming, and I'm going to have to find a nice, dry place to spend the night." The husband said, "Oh, no, it will not do. What kind of people would we be if we let you go outside when there was a storm coming? You are welcome to stay with us tonight." Tayman said, "That was wonderful. Thank you so much." And so they continued their discussions, chatted about this, chatted about that. Eventually the wife got up from her stool, walked over to the stove, opened the door of the stove and pulled out the cake. And now the aroma of the cake just filled the room even more so. And she put the cake right on the table, and the Tayman just soaked in that wonderful aroma. until he could take it no longer, and he said, "Oh, please, madam, would you be so kind? May I have a slice of that cake?" And she said, "Oh, sure, certainly." And she pulled a knife, began to cut a piece of cake for the Tayman, when the husband said, "No! You know you can't cut a piece of cake when it's hot off the oven. He's going to have to wait till the morning with the rest of us." The Tayman was a bit disappointed at that, but he was the guest, and he had to abide by the rules of the house. So they talked some more. It got darker. You could hear the storm coming in because it started to rain, and the wind picked up and blew pretty hard. So indeed, there was a storm. They had reached their home, but it was time to go to bed. As you may remember, as I introduced the earlier in the story, there was but one bed in the house. So the husband got up, walked over to the bed, and pushed it against the wall. And then he turned to his wife and said, "You shall lie down here, the end of the bed against the wall." He says, "I'll lay down in the middle." And Tayman, he pointed to the Tayman and said, "You shall lay down right here at the other end of the bed." Then he asked the Tayman to turn around, which he did. And when he turned around, his wife, the husband's wife, put on her nightgown. And when she was finished with that, he told the Tayman, "You can turn around now." And the Tayman and the husband each put on a nightshirt, and they went to bed. The wife at the end against the wall, husband in the middle, Tayman at the other side. And it didn't take long at all before all three of them were asleep. Now the husband had a problem, and I guess the best way, the most delicate way to explain that is to simply say he had a problem with frequency. So it wasn't long after he fell asleep that he had to use the facilities. So he got out of bed, started to walk to the door, and then realized, no, I can't leave my wife alone in bed with the Tayman. So he grabbed his wife, who was asleep. He woke her up, grabbed her, and pulled him with her outside. You may recall when I described this home, I did not describe any facilities inside. The facilities were outside. So he grabbed his wife, he walked outside to the facilities, stood his wife up outside the facilities. He went inside the facilities to do what he had to do because he had this issue of frequency. All the while, his wife was outside. Rain was pouring down in buckets at the time. And his wife was getting soaking wet while he was inside in the facilities. And when he was finished, he got out, grabbed his wife by the hand, led his soaking wet wife inside. She laid down at the end by the wall. Husband laid down in the middle. Tayman was still on the other side. And they all fell asleep again. A little while later, the husband had to get up again because, as you may recall, he had a problem with frequency. So the husband got up, grabbed his wife, pulled her outside. Rain is pouring down all over her while he is inside using the facilities. He gets done, grabs her by the hand, leads her back into the house. She lays down against the wall. Husband lays down in the middle. Tayman is still asleep on the other end. A little while later, after they had all fallen asleep, the husband had to use the facilities yet again because he had a problem with frequency. So he grabbed his wife, tried to pull her up out of bed to go outside while he used the facilities, and she said, "No, I'm done. I am still cold and wet from the last time you used the facilities." So the husband tried to figure out, what do I do? So he figured out what to do. He went over to the crib, picked up the crib, put the crib in the middle of the bed. So now you had the wife still wet at one end of the bed against the wall, the crib in the middle, the Tayman on the other side. Husband goes outside, uses the facilities. When he's done, he comes back in, puts the crib back on the floor. He lays down, in the middle of the bed. And before he falls asleep, he starts listening to the wind and the rain. And he begins to hear the door of the facilities kind of flapping. The wind had kind of pulled it off its latch. And he begins to think that perhaps the wind will take the door right off the hinges. And he hears roof materials kind of flying off the facilities. And he hears the walls of his facilities beginning to rattle. And thinks perhaps the wind is going to just yank the walls right off. And since he has a problem with facilities, he's likely to use the facility again. So he figures out, I have to do something, and he jumps out of bed. He realizes he has to fix the facilities. And you know, when you have a problem, you tend to focus on that problem. And when you have two problems, sometimes you focus on problem number 2 and forget about problem number 1. And that's what happened to the husband. He was so focused on the problem of the possible loss of his facilities, he forgot all about the fact that he left his wife alone in bed with the Tayman. So he went outside and he grabbed some rope and he tries to tie the walls of the facilities together and latch something around the roof so it doesn't blow away. He gets a hammer and he starts banging on the door to try to keep that locked in place. All the while getting soaking wet because the storm is now horrendous and it's just rain is coming down so hard and the wind is so hard and heavy. Now the wife hears all this going on and she knows her husband well. And she knows this task will take her husband a long time. So she was laying against the wall of the bed. And when she realizes her husband was going to be preoccupied for some time, she rolled to the middle of the bed. And she said to the Tayman, "Okay, Tayman, now's your chance." Tayman said, "Yes, it is." And the Tayman jumped out of bed, ran to the table, and cut himself a piece of cake. Now that's the Tayman, the story by Eamon Kelly. I'm glad to share it with all of you folks in Dublin, Ohio. Now please take a look at my website, clandonald.net. Send me an email at gmail.com. Take a look at my Facebook site and like and share it. And I started because there aren't any Irish festivals going on in America or anywhere. I started a podcast, and I have a podcast every Sunday night. So take a look at my Facebook page. You'll see announcements of it. You'll also see, if you go to my website, there's an icon on the homepage where you can click into the current podcast or any prior podcast. And that's the way I tell stories when we're not allowed to go to Irish festivals because of that wee little thing called the coronavirus, which is causing such havoc throughout the world. So thank you again, Dublin. Wish I were there in person. Goodbye and Shlán.